grabbed Morrison's arm. "Look at the trees. Look at them." The massive Douglas firs around the clearing were moving, not swaying in wind. There was still no wind, but expanding and contracting like enormous lungs. The bark split open in places, revealing flesh-like tissue underneath that pulsed with veins of sap that looked disturbingly like blood. "Now," Morrison ordered, but as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked. Where the trail had been moments before, new trees had somehow grown, their breathing trunks forming an impenetrable wall. The forest had trapped them. Isabella tried to climb one of the barriers, but the moment her hands touched the bark, the tree's breathing quickened, and tendrils of what looked like root systems burst from the ground, wrapping around her ankles. She screamed as they began to pull her down into the earth itself. "The trees aren't just alive," Dr. Wells gasped, backing toward the center of the clearing. "They're carnivorous. They've evolved to mimic a forest ecosystem while actually being one massive organism. The missing hikers, they're not dead. They're being digested." Morrison fired his weapon at the nearest tree, but the bullets simply absorbed into the breathing bark without effect. The organism was too vast, too ancient to be stopped by conventional means. As night fell, the breathing grew thunderous. In the darkness, they could see the truth, bioluminescent veins running through every tree trunk, all connected underground in a vast network. The entire forest was one living entity that had been feeding on lost travelers for centuries. "Listen," Dr. Wells whispered urgently. "In the breathing. Do you hear it? Between the inhales and exhales, there were voices, dozens of them. All the missing hikers, their consciousness somehow absorbed into the forest organism, their voices joining the eternal respiratory chorus. Claire," Morrison heard Chen's voice calling from somewhere in the darkness between the trees. "Claire, I found you. It's beautiful here. You have to see. You have to breathe with us." One by one, the surviving team members felt the overwhelming urge to walk toward the breathing trees. The organism was calling to them, promising unity, promising to make them part of something vast and eternal. Dr. Wells was the first to surrender, walking calmly toward a massive fir whose trunk split open like a mouth, revealing a warm, wet interior lined with what looked like lungs. "It doesn't hurt," she called back to Morrison and Isabella. "It's like coming home." Isabella fought the compulsion longer, but eventually even she walked toward the trees, her eyes vacant and peaceful. "The forest needs us," she murmured. "We're just nutrients it's been waiting for." Morrison was alone now in the center of the clearing, the breathing sound so loud it was like standing inside a giant heart. All around him, the trees pulsed with life, their breathing perfectly synchronized. He could hear all the voices now, dozens of hikers who had been absorbed over the years, all part of the forest's consciousness. His phone still had signal. With trembling fingers, he sent one final message to headquarters. "Asterisk, the forest is alive. It breathes. It feeds. Don't send rescue teams. Burn it all. Burn it all before it spreads. Asterisk." As he hit send, Morrison felt the irresistible urge to join the others. The trees were so beautiful when they breathed, so welcoming. He took a step forward, then another. The breathing grew softer now, almost like a lullaby. The last thing he recorded was the sound of his own voice, joining the eternal chorus of the forest's breathing, as the trees welcomed another meal into their living embrace. The audio file was found 3 days later by a cleanup crew, along with the abandoned campsite. But by then, the whispering woods had grown by several acres, its breathing audible for miles around, and somewhere in the darkness between the trees, new voices were learning to exhale in perfect harmony with the forest's ancient, hungry lungs. The chainsaw's engine roared to life, drowning out the unnatural silence that had settled over Blackwood Forest like a burial shroud. Dr. James Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow despite the October chill, his hands trembling as he adjusted his grip on the machine. Something was wrong here, something that made his skin crawl and his scientific mind rebel against what his eyes were telling him. "Just trees," he muttered to himself, the words lost in the mechanical growl. Just goddamn trees. But they weren't just trees. Not anymore. The logging expedition had been routine, or so the Canadian Forestry Department had claimed. A small section of old-growth forest needed clearing for a new highway. Simple, clean, profitable. What they hadn't mentioned in the briefing was the smell that hung in the air like copper pennies in decay, or the way the shadows moved when they shouldn't, or how the ground felt soft and spongy beneath their boots, as if something wet and hungry lurked just below the surface. Mitchell, the voice of his supervisor, Roger Whitmore, cut through the noise. "You gonna stand there all day philosophizing, or are you gonna cut some timber?" James nodded grimly and pressed the chainsaw against the bark of the massive oak before him. The tree had to be at least 300 years old, its trunk so wide that 4 men couldn't wrap their arms around it. Ancient, majestic, and absolutely, undeniably alive in a way that made his stomach turn. The blade bit into the wood, and the tree screamed. Not the sharp crack of splitting timber or the groan of stressed wood, a genuine, agonized shriek that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself. James stumbled backward, nearly dropping the chainsaw as crimson liquid began to pour from the cut. Not sap, not resin. Blood. Thick, dark, arterial blood that spilled down the bark like tears from a wound. What the hell? Roger's voice died in his throat as he witnessed the impossible sight. The other members of their team, Tom Bradley from Birmingham, Antoine Dubois from Quebec, and Klaus Weber from Munich, all stopped their work and gathered around the bleeding tree. Their faces were pale masks of disbelief and growing terror. "This is impossible," Klaus whispered in his thick German accent. "Trees do not bleed. They cannot bleed." But the evidence was right there before them, pooling at the base of the oak in an expanding crimson lake. The smell hit them then, metallic and organic, like a slaughterhouse on a hot summer day. Tom retched and stumbled away, his breakfast painting the forest floor in acidic streaks. "We need to leave," Antoine said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave now." That's when they heard it, a sound that made their blood freeze in their veins, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed at their feet, like a massive heartbeat, like the earth itself was alive and breathing. James looked down and watched in horror as the blood from the tree began to seep into the ground. But it wasn't simply soaking in like spilled water. The earth was drinking it, pulling it down with an almost eager thirst that spoke of ancient hunger and unspeakable need. "The reports," Roger stammered, pulling a crumpled file from his jacket with shaking hands. There were reports. Missing persons. Hikers who never came back. The local tribes. They called this place the Bleeding Ground. More trees began to weep crimson tears, as if the injury to one had awakened something in all of them. The forest was bleeding, and the ground beneath their feet pulsed with terrible life. "Look at the roots," Tom gasped, pointing with a trembling finger. The massive root system of the oak was becoming visible as the earth shifted and moved. But these weren't normal roots. They were red and slick, pulsing with veins like arteries, and they were moving, writhing, reaching. The trees weren't just bleeding, they were feeding, and they were hungry. Klaus tried to run, but his foot caught on something, and he tumbled to the blood-soaked ground. When he looked down, he saw that a root, thick as a man's arm and wet with fresh blood, had wrapped around his ankle. More roots burst from the earth around him, reaching with desperate hunger. "Help me!" he screamed as the roots began to pull him toward the base of the nearest tree. "Help me, please." The others grabbed his arms and pulled, but the roots were incredibly strong. James could see them pulsing, pumping something up from deep in the earth. Klaus's skin was growing pale, his eyes rolling back as whatever the roots were doing to him drained the life from his body. That's when James noticed his own feet. The ground around his boots was soft and yielding, and he could feel something moving beneath the surface. Probing. Testing. Hungry. "The whole forest," he whispered in dawning horror. "The whole damn forest is one organism." The trees weren't individual entities. They were part of something larger. Something that had been sleeping beneath Blackwood Forest for centuries, sustained by the occasional hiker or camper who wandered too far from the marked trails. But now it was waking up, getting stronger, getting hungrier. Roger was backing toward their truck, his face white with terror. "We have to get out of here. We have to warn people. This whole area needs to be quarantined." But as they reached the edge of their small clearing, they discovered that the path they'd used to enter was gone. Where once there had been a clear trail, now there was only a wall of bleeding trees, their branches interwoven like fingers, their roots carpeting the ground in a web of crimson hunger. They were trapped. "There has to be another way out," Antoine said, but his voice held no conviction. The forest around them pulsed with malevolent life, and they could hear Klaus's weakening screams as the roots continued their horrible work. That's when James saw the bones, half buried in the soft, blood-soaked earth were the scattered remains of previous visitors to Blackwood Forest. Yellowed skulls grinned up at them from between the writhing roots. Rib cages formed crude cages around smaller saplings. Femurs and arm bones were woven into the very structure of the trees themselves, as if the forest had been using human remains as fertilizer for generations. "How many?" Tom whispered. "How many people has this thing killed?" The answer came in the form of a voice, weak and desperate, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Help, please, someone help me." It was a woman's voice, speaking with what sounded like an Australian accent. James felt his heart sink as he realized there were others still alive out there, still being slowly consumed by this nightmare ecosystem. "We have to help her," he said, knowing even as he spoke that it was probably a trap. The forest was intelligent. It could mimic voices, lure victims deeper into its embrace. But what choice did they have? As they moved deeper into Blackwood Forest, following the desperate cries for help, the trees seemed to close in around them. Their bleeding branches formed a canopy so thick that barely any sunlight filtered through. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with the smell of blood and decay. The pulsing beneath their feet grew stronger, and James realized with growing horror that they were walking deeper into the creature's digestive system. The trees weren't just feeding on blood. They were processing it, breaking it down, using it to fuel their impossible growth. There, Antoine pointed ahead to where they could see a figure trapped among the roots of a massive pine tree. It was indeed a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and blood. But as they got closer, James could see that the roots had grown through her skin, connecting her to the tree like some horrific force system. "Please," she whispered as they approached. "I've been here for days. It's been feeding on me, keeping me alive so it can drain me slowly." Her name was Victoria Chun, and she'd been hiking from Vancouver when she'd stumbled into this nightmare. The roots had caught her on her first night, and since then, she'd been trapped in a living hell, watching as the forest slowly consumed her life force. "We're getting you out of here," James promised, but even as he spoke, he could see more roots emerging from the ground around them. The forest knew they were there. It was preparing to feed. "You can't," Victoria whispered. "It won't let you. It's too strong, too hungry, and it's been waiting so long for a feast like this." The truth hit James like a physical blow. They hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. The logging contract, the precise location, the timing, it had all been orchestrated. Someone or something had been feeding people to this monster for years, keeping it satisfied with a steady diet of hikers and campers. But now it wanted more. It wanted a real meal. The roots erupted from the ground all around them, thick as tree trunks and slick with blood. They moved with terrible purpose, wrapping around legs and arms, pulling the screaming men toward the hungry earth. James felt one coil around his waist and squeeze, driving the air from his lungs. As he was dragged toward the base of a bleeding oak, James caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of the tree were names and dates going back decades, a record of everyone who had been consumed by this place. And at the very bottom, fresh cuts in the wood, were the names of his team members. Someone had been planning this for a very long time. The last thing James Mitchell saw before the roots pulled him into the hungry earth was a figure watching from the edge of the clearing, a park ranger in a crisp uniform, making notes in a small leather book. The man looked up and smiled, revealing teeth stained red with blood. Then the darkness took him, and Blackwood Forest claimed 5 more victims for its endless feast. But the